I'm Mike Barthel, and this is Risk Work. Our first guest is a cybersecurity risk management expert that I've had the pleasure of knowing for the past 5 or 6 years. He has extensive security design experience with different business verticals. His time with the DoD has given him the foundation for his security experience, and I met him working on NERC and FERC compliance projects. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Isiah Jones.
Woo! Yeah.
Hi, Isiah. How are you doing today?
Fine. You? What's going on, Mike?
Oh, man, I'm so glad to have you on here. Thanks for taking time with me on this today. You're one of the first persons I ever talked to about security and compliance 5 or 6 years ago, and one of the first people I thought of when putting together this podcast. So, what we were doing is trying to come up with 5 or 6 public safety kind of issues that go along with this stuff. And I know that in the past, you and I have talked about change management, Isiah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, change management is always hard, regardless of the size of the organization, because you're trying to change culture. A lot of people think change management is just, focused on the technology, but it's not just the technology. I mean, I can think of many examples when I was at FERC or when I was in DoD or being a contractor, just going into new organizations. Anytime you try to introduce something new, whether it's the right thing to do or not, you're going to meet resistance. You're going to meet fear, uncertainty. People are afraid of the unknowns. A lot of times, what you see is people know what to do, but they're just scared to take action. And for me, everyone knows I'm the guy that likes to just go out there kicking the doors and get it done. So I get frustrated in that kind of situation. It's also a leadership crisis, right? So, in the issues we face today with our infrastructure, convergence in particular, and people attacking infrastructure, whether it's disgruntled employees, nation states, that part's irrelevant. I think the fact that infrastructure is being targeted and we're changing the infrastructure all at the same time and removing traditional safeguards, that is the bigger issue that I think people should worry about. And we're going to need huge change agents that actually understand those issues. And I mean, actually understand the technical nuances, not just theory, right? And the biggest problem with change management is I think you have a lot of folks that just don't have the courage to do the right things, or you have folks that are kind of like those big personalities that we always have in society, where yeah, they can get the crowd stirred up, but they have no clue what's going on underneath. And in my opinion, that's actually dangerous because those folks, while we could use them to drive change, it might not be the right change, right? So I think when you say the word change management, it means people. For the purposes of this podcast, when you talk about our infrastructure and industrial control system, which is what I focus on the past several years, we need certain changes to happen. We need people to understand that control systems aren't like your typical business IT systems. We need people to understand that there's certain changes in how they do procurement, specifications, design, integration, testing, and validation that they need to kind of implement as part of their culture. That requires them to change their culture. That requires existing traditional silos to work together in different ways. That requires them to look at the organization from a matrix perspective. In DoD, we didn't have that problem. But all these years I spent with all the commercial folks, that seems to be like they continue to want to balkanize things. And I've always pushed that you need to change the org chart in general. So I always push that, hey, the org chart doesn't have to be IT and engineering. The org chart should be IT and engineering, stay where you are, and create a security engineer that's in charge of all the ICS and have them be the multidisciplinary team where they focus on those issues. And that's a cultural change, right? And most of the organizations I run into, they don't want to do it. They just want to assign the role to someone else that's already there instead of create a new position, a new role with a new piece of the organization and take that matrix approach. So change management is a huge word, and I'm sure we could talk on and on and on, but we'll probably have some other topics to cover.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And that kind of leads me to the next question and kind of around morals and ethics, Isiah. I mean, it sounds like the whole culture, the change would lead into some different changes within those two factors as well.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and you see how this stuff ties together, right? Because like I said, with morals and ethics, there's a lot of changes being made, like doing ICS in the cloud. Well, there's a way you should do it. And I think a lot of folks are just rushing to chase that new shiny object, right? So then the morals and ethics of that is like, should we do that? Should we have apps on our phones, knowing that we take our phones home and kids play with our phones? Should we have an app that allows us to remote, control a pump or a valve or a breaker or, God forbid, trains? Should we be doing that? I don't think anyone's thought about the morals and ethics of it. We're just thinking about, hey, I can make money, or hey, this makes it easier. I can lay off all these people and save on labor costs, and they can just do this stuff from home. It's like, okay, yeah, you could, but should you be doing it is the question. No, I don't think anyone's stopping to think about that. It is only people like me in the industry that have been out in the field, have been in the valve stations, the pump stations, have been inside the electric substation. I mean, some of the folks that I work with that have been around for 40 years, way longer than I have, I always talk to them, and they have friends that have died just trying to go down in the manhole to do their job. And I don't think people are thinking the more you automate, the more you connect all these cool technologies. Should we do this? Should we have, I just saw the other day someone posted about hackers talking to people's kids through baby monitors. Well, I mean, we allowed that to happen. And years ago, people like me, when we first saw that, even before I got an ICS, when I was still just doing IT cybersecurity, that was already an unknown issue, but people continue to choose to do it. Um, the morals and ethics of how do these devices work? How should they work? Not just regulations, which we'll probably cover later, but should people be putting these devices in their home with their children, especially if they don't take the time to figure out how to configure it? Is that a moral and ethical issue? I think it is. If you're a good parent, shouldn't you want to learn how the device works? Shouldn't you want the FTC and other people to require these manufacturers to put certain security functional features in and to use the international standards that already define these things? I think that's a societal issue that people need to think about that. Um, so from a moral and ethical perspective, I think it falls on society to pay attention to how things work, what they're buying, how they're using it. I think it falls on businesses to pay attention to how they're making things, not just for profit. And personally, I think morally and ethically, they should stop waiting until there's requirements and regulations. They should just start designing it right in the first place. I mean, I sit on one of the international standards committees for control system security, the 62443. And I'm always advocating that a lot of the vendors need to just make the stuff right in the first place. Put the capabilities in there. Yes, we know the old legacy stuff is sitting out there for 40 years. That's a different issue. But the stuff that we're building now, let's stop making excuses, right? Let's stop saying it's going to cost more when it's just another line of code. In fact, it might even be removing code that shouldn't be there in the first place. That's a moral and ethical issue to me, not a financial or time constraint issue. Because I've been on projects where literally the stuff we're asking them to do is like, flash the firmware in 5 seconds to get rid of telnet because we don't need it. Like, seriously, is that really costing more time when you're already in the device? To me, I think that's a moral issue. And
Right.
I think they shouldn't be charging people money to do something like that. And I mean, that's a very, very, rudimentary example, but that's the half the attack surface is stuff like that. Believe it or not, especially when you talk about industrial control systems, how they're designed, how they're integrated. Sometimes people integrate things just because they can, thinking about the consequences from a public perspective. They're only thinking about it from a like, I gotta save some money here, or I got we're behind schedule here, or oh, this is gonna like make my profits and my stock price go up. Okay, that's cool, but you're talking about the public. You're talking about trains, cars, water, electric, pumps, valves. Mixing chemicals to make medicines and baby food. I think there's a moral and ethical piece to that people just aren't paying attention to.
Well, I agree with you. And I know that when I do my work, one thing I find is that a lot of the policies have been created domestically. And I
Yep.
guess to kind of transition into this, Isaiah, how does that work when a lot of like the US companies have a global presence, and how are we doing on keeping up globally, I guess?
Well, yeah, this is a huge problem that I ran into in DoD and in FERC. So in the DoD examples, when I was out in the field doing these assessments of substations, facilities, all the chillers, boilers, air handlers, gas and oil facilities, ports, airfields. I mean, there's places in certain countries that on mission where we, had highly classified special operations, special forces, drones, and we're using that country's like civilian airfield and like somebody could walk across the airfield if they wanted to, right? It's like we don't think about these issues. And then when I was at FERC, doing architectural reviews, in the National Security Office, which was all voluntary, non-regulatory, because we are separate from regulatory offices, because we focus on the public safety and national security, which is what has been my bread and butter the past 15 years of my whole career. It's always been mission focused for me. Never, I mean, people hate when I say this, but I don't care about profit. I care about how you operate and how it impacts people. Especially considering I grew up in the ghetto where a lot of the infrastructure and anybody who lives in urban environments or poor neighborhoods, you're 100% dependent on whatever the infrastructure is. You have no say. You don't even know how it works, which is an issue, right? Society should be aware of those things. But a lot of these companies are being bought by foreign entities. Also, FERC in particular has even approved because right, wrong, or different, they are a utility commission. They've approved some companies that may not have America's best interest in mind from China and other places to operate legally in critical areas of our infrastructure, like the midstream gas in the shale region, where a lot of our gas products come from, especially in the midstream gas market. Um, you know, should they be doing that? That links back into morals and ethics, right? But a lot of these companies, we have some of our liquefied natural gas companies in regions of the country I won't mention. But going out to some of them, we found out they were bought by European companies or Asian companies. And it's like, okay, we're requiring them to do certain security things for the U.S. Follow NIST, follow NERC, follow some OSHA requirements. But when they connect all their systems and control systems across the whole company, which a lot of these companies do, especially that one in particular, they had a flat network that went all the way back from one region of the country to another region of the company, overseas to you know, their corporate infrastructure. And I'm like, okay, so you're going to use this one firewall that doesn't really speak ICS protocols for industrial control systems, and you're connecting all this stuff back, and then you got people in different countries remoting into things. That's because they're a global business. Um, our infrastructure companies, they buy and sell all the time. Mergers, divestments, acquisitions. I mean, there's some of these big, the really big ones in particular that I won't mention. There's at least two I can think of that start with an N. I remember being on phone calls with some of their people while they were divesting and getting rid of that company as we were on the phone with those folks, and they stopped the meeting because they realized they didn't have a job anymore. I've literally had that happen years ago,
Gee,
just trying to
I,
meet with them to do security services.
I think I know who you're talking about on that. So
Yeah, I
talk,
mean, there's a couple of them that
yeah,
there's a few they didn't even know that they owned the asset, or like we went to one site we didn't know it was owned by that. It's like this is reality on the ground.
and that dependency of infrastructure kind of leads me to the next question is, the interdependency of infrastructure. And that seems to be a really hot topic right now, Isaiah.
Yeah, I mean, years ago, especially when I was doing all the assessments for DoD. So this was after I left civil service and I came back as a contractor after like trying to take a break from DoD and doing some contract work with civilian agencies. I kind of crossed into ICS, starting with smart meters and then going out in the substations and then looking at water and wastewater and then airfield satellites. I mean, I was running all types of facilities, hospitals, just buildings in general, land mobile radio, emergency operations centers. And when I started getting in those environments, I was on a multidisciplinary team and we had emergency management people, chemical biological response people. I had MARSOC guys. I had Navy SEALs. I mean, we had a cool team. Civil engineers, mechanical, electrical, and the thing that came out of that was the mission assurance and all threats, all hazards, infrastructure protection approach. We looked for single points of failures. So like having electrical conduit, telecom conduit, and water or gas conduit all in the same manhole. Well, that's dangerous. One, in certain places you shouldn't do that. I mean, we were in manholes where the manhole was flooded and they had electrical and telecom in a flooded manhole and a pipe that we didn't even know was in that pipe, all in the same manhole. And we had third party nationals going in and out there, and no one knew who they were for, where they came from, how they were vetted. So you start talking about interdependencies and single points of failures, especially at a municipality level or a military base level. I don't think a lot of people are paying attention to that, right? From a natural disaster perspective, natural threats, yes, there's FEMA and the emergency management community has done a great job of like putting out free materials, training. They have their EOCs operating. They at this point since 9/11, they have a lot of people in place. Like they know which electric utility to call in case of a disaster. They kind of know, not all of them, but a lot of them do kind of know like in what order certain things should get power. There's those discussions already happening. But I don't think they've gotten to the point from, hey, if someone does a cyber attack on X, Y, and Z, or does a cyber physical attack where it's like attacking a substation both electronically and physically, how does that impact this hospital? What happens for local municipal level cascading impacts? When you talk about the power grid, it's not one grid, it's interconnected. But most people are only talking about transmission and bulk generation. They fail to forget or to remember uh, large municipalities like New York, DC, New Orleans, any ports, there's a lot of convergent infrastructure. There's the right of way is limited, so you're cramming a ton of stuff in the same right of way: trains, pipelines, telecom, electric, for water, oil, and gas. And you have residents from neighborhoods over gas lines. It's crazy. Um, just had a fire here in Alexandria like a week or two ago. Some new building they were building, and I'm hearing in the news and rumors around the neighborhood they were building on top of something that might have been a right of way issue that caused that whole building to burn down. They just started building it. The infrastructure is very interdependent. I've seen a lot of utilities that are dependent on gas, and in regions of the country where that's their only source of generating power or their only source of fuel. So it's like if they're under attack, where's their alternative source of fuel? And I know we'll get into that later. But locally, if you lose power and electric and telecom, I mean, society is gonna be kind of screwed. We have some emergency communications. We have some of that set up, but I don't think they've war gamed it from an attacker perspective. Persistently being attacked, not just hurricane came through and kicked everyone's ass, but someone's actively doing it, and they're doing it in real time. Meaning, if they mess with a substation, that's not the only thing they're going to mess with. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, and that thank you for kind of bringing up that issue of diversified generation. I mean, it would seem like we're getting better at that, aren't we?
We are in certain regions of the country, but I've been in regions of the country where, like, if you go beyond a certain point, they're dependent on gas pipelines, and they don't have they're not shipping a lot of coal up there, and they have some liquefied natural gas, they have some hydro, but I don't think if we were under attack and depending on who the adversaries or a combination of adversaries are, if they start targeting certain hydro, certain LNG facilities, certain valve and pump stations along pipelines, not getting into the classified side, but we know that certain OEM equipment that certain pipelines use have been compromised for years. We know that. That's the reason why DOE and everyone's been constantly pushing it out. But people like me that had those clearances years ago, we knew the details of that years ago.
Right.
It was a lot worse than what they're putting out in the public. So that goes back into the morals and ethics of what should we tell the public, when should we tell them, et cetera. But those regions of the country, I'm always wondering when I'm out doing assessments or trying to help them build a security program, or I'm doing, we'll get into later, like system security engineering for the control systems. I'm always looking at it from that old DoD critical infrastructure protection, mission assurance, all threats, all hazards perspective of, hey, if this happens, do you have fuel trucks? What kind of agreements in place? Who gets priority if it's a regional issue? How are you going to do black start if your generator is compromised, if your turbine's compromised? Those GE black start generators and turbines, the ones from Siemens, like the T3000, yeah, well, they're controlled by PLCs that have code in it, logic in it. They use protocols that aren't built with security. You can manipulate those protocols. You can manipulate the logic, which you can cause those things not to start or spin or do what they're supposed to. So I don't think people are thinking about it from an attack perspective. If someone's actively doing this, whether it's an insider, someone makes a mistake, or it's a coordinated attack on a region, we need to look at it from that perspective of, if it's local, how do we handle that? Because you're going to impact other infrastructures. Just in that region alone, if they don't have the ability to generate power, they lose their gas, they lose their LNG, they're going to be in a world of hurt. because they don't have a lot of hydro. Some of them are starting to build offshore wind, and I don't see us shipping coal up there unless they have strategic reserves somewhere that I didn't know about because it was compartmented and I didn't have a need to know. But I can tell you that most of the two regions I'm thinking about, they don't have strategic coals in the coal in those regions. If we do, good job. But I'm almost certain we don't, just be from past experiences and meetings and in fights. Um, those regions are kind of screwed. Some of them are doing solar. You know, you think of the West Coast. I don't know how much solar is in the Northeast. Southwest, they could probably do some oil, gas, coal. They can figure certain things, but there's certain regions of the country. It's like, hey, this is where they get their power from, and that's it. uh, you know, it's like yeah, they lose that. It's gonna be a cascade in that region. It may not cascade across the whole grid, so all the FUD people out there, they're right about that. But where they're wrong or short-sighted is that may not be the adversary's objective. If they're targeting New York, who gives a crap about the rest of the transmission grid? They're targeting an area, and we already know what people have targeted areas before. I mean, most of this stuff started after people used box cutters from Home Depot to hijack a freaking plane and fly it into a building. Um, they targeted those areas, and it completely changed our country. So I don't think people are looking at it from a localized interdependency. What happens if they target water and electric? What happens if they target emergency management and telecommunications? How are those things interrelated? And then crossing into another topic, when you start getting into the technical details, how those things designed, how those control systems and telecommunication systems and that infrastructure even designed and integrated, because that's something that people don't pay attention to.
Well, I know in our past conversations, and you've been very helpful explaining uh, different scenarios to me in the past, Isaiah. But one of the things you've always kind of talked about is how, with your background in security systems design, how it might be a better idea to just take it from the security side first and kind of work backward through compliance. And I'd be interested to hear your point on that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us in the security world, especially those of us that came from the system design side, I mean, that's one of those things I'm always grateful to Penn State and in the Navy for is that both my undergrad and my undergrad in systems design, systems integrations, information science technology, and working for the Navy during while I was in school those years of seeing how to properly do systems engineering with security as a mandate, not optional. If we're going to engineer I mean, obviously we were warfighters, right? So people are going to make the excuse of, oh, that's because DoD was doing that. Well, yeah, we weren't perfect, but we knew we had to do it. And people need to think about if you're designing stuff properly, if you're putting in all those functional capabilities or removing the ones that shouldn't be there, that's basic security 101. That's basic system security engineering 101. That should be done across the board. But it, a lot of people aren't doing that because they're chasing compliance or regulation. Compliance or regulation is really trying to get you to do what you should have been doing in the first place, but it's one of those things where, like I mentioned, 9/11, we should have been paying attention to who's getting on the plane and what they're bringing. We waited till something happened. We waited till people died, and then we overreacted. And now we got to do stupid stuff that doesn't actually stop those kind of attacks. And we know that it's security theater, but it's the same thing with regulation. I mean, when I was at FERC, I worked with the SLs that created SIP, and let's just say it's not the way they all wanted it to be, right? It's better than nothing, but that's what regulations get you. They get you attention to the board level, to society. They get you to do the basic bare minimum, but they blind people who didn't want to do the right thing in the first place, right? And that ties into morals and ethics. If people are doing these things right, we probably wouldn't need the regulations. The reason why we have the regulations is because people weren't doing it. And to be honest with you, even with the regulations, people are trying to find ways not to classify things as cyber assets. They do that all the time. All of us know that, especially those of us that have done some of the work that I've done. That's a problem. If they were focused on doing the right thing in the first place, they would be compliant. Most of the stuff you read in compliance, especially regulations and standards, is telling you to do stuff you should already been doing.
Why do you think they couple IT with OT when it comes to security, and why is that not changing faster?
Isaiah's 2 cents is this a lot of ignorance. um, marketing buzzword and ignorance and just pure freaking laziness, just like the whole doing security versus compliance. If people were doing what they were supposed to, they would already be able to check the stupid compliance box. People are saying ITOT because they're thinking about networks. They're not thinking about how does a pump actually work, how it's wired, what protocols and conduits and radio frequencies are involved, and the public safety issues, because they're only thinking about, hey, I got this project, I need to save money, and it's going to make my life easier. They're not thinking about, hey, if I do this, this is going to create an attack surface that's not even necessary because I'm assuming that no one can get to it because I'm only thinking about networks and laptops, and I'm not thinking about it's a freaking pump. And if their target is the damn pump, they don't need the other stuff to get to it because their target is the pump. And you should be looking at it from an all threats, all hazards perspective. And people use these terms because it's easy to describe stuff to people that don't understand and don't have the time and or the interest to do their due diligence to go actually learn something. So if they actually took the time to learn the process, what is process control loop? What does a pump do? What is actuation? What is the drive? What is a motor? What is a variable frequency drive? What kind of logic languages are in a PLC? What is a PLC? I mean, I just sent you that email earlier with like the Real Pars YouTube channel. They always have these cool 1 to 20 minute clips of what is a variable frequency drive? What is PLC versus DCS? What is DCS versus SCADA? So that you can understand that IT/OT is not even a real thing. It's a marketing term, and it's an ignorance issue. It's used for convenience of, hey, we got to do all this stuff. Let's go through the motions. Let's slap some tools in. Let's do some monitoring, and we're done. It's the same mistake we made in IT. If you remember when SIM and all the cool shiny objects came out, people stopped doing basic incident handling like as a discipline. They started depending on their SIMs and every other tool that they came up with instead of like teaching people what we all learned, 10, 15 years ago. It's like, this is the discipline of incident handling and forensics and malware analysis and systems design and systems validation, business process logic, user acceptance testing. They've abandoned these disciplines and then they wonder why they can't fix anything because monitoring the problem doesn't fix it. It just tells you
Right.
that it's there if you can find it. And finding it doesn't mean you're going to fix it either. And that's why I focus on the design side,
Right.
because that's where you actually fix it or make it not a problem in the first place.
I don't think the public realizes how scary the PLC SCADA situation is.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary only because you have folks that are so bent on, let me check the compliance box, let me plug in this little shiny tool because I think it's going to solve the problem. Let me use words like IT/OT when they should just be saying industrial control systems, automation, and focused on that issue. And that goes back to change management of creating a new team that's multidisciplinary, that strictly focuses on those things instead of treating it like a collateral duty for engineers and IT, because that requires a cultural and mental change. That also requires people to look at it from a moral and ethical perspective of how should we do this? What do we actually need? How do we get rid of the things we don't need? And just because we can do it, should we be doing it? You see how all these issues come together, because there are a lot of people that just don't look at the technical details. So, like you saw how short those real parts videos are. They could spend 5 minutes watching the video to learn how VFD works, to learn the difference between Profibus and Profinet, and understand that it's not about the IP address. It's about the device itself. It's about the process loop. It's about the logic. It's about what it's controlling. A lot of folks aren't looking at that. Um, Traditional engineers are looking at what they're looking for, and traditional IT are looking at the network. They're not looking at system design, system security engineering like some of us do. They're just looking at network monitoring, and that's out of ignorance, right? People are going to do what they're comfortable with. If they don't have the time or the willpower or the interest, they're not going to go investigate the rest of it. And the adversaries take full advantage of that. I've had customers that have had insider threats that were maintenance technicians that they hired specifically because they were the only ones that knew how that equipment worked. Then they became a disgruntled, pissed off insider on second
Right.
shift that got sent home and didn't give back their laptop. So they did the right thing by cutting the guy's badge. But what I tried to explain to him is, who gives a crap about his badge? The dude was the maintenance tech that programmed every PLC and was in all your cabinets. And he still had laptop that has all the programming software, probably all of the engineering drawings and everything else you don't want out in the world. Do they know where their laptop is? No, because it didn't have LoJack on it. They had no ability to remote wipe it. It probably wasn't even encrypted. And that guy could probably sell it on the black market, or he can find ways back in. They caught him trying to get in through Wi-Fi, which is why they cut his badge and his access. But I explained to them, yeah, that was elementary step one. Good job. But you're not done. I think they filed a police report. They're never going to see that laptop. But those kind of things happen all the time. So when everyone's focused on trying to try and take down the grid, oh, don't worry about it. They're giving people a false sense of security, and they're it's like playing the find the ball under the cup game with a cat. It's like, where'd we move the ball to this time?
Right. No. Well, and I tell you what, Isaiah, I appreciate the lengthy conversation and, the critical points that you've hit on this. And I just want to kind of wrap up right now and just invite you to come back. We'd like to have a panel with you and a few other experts in the field in a couple of weeks, and love to have you come back if that's okay with you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you should talk to some emergency management experts. Just talk to some folks about, some special forces guys that do real red teaming, not pen testing, because those are two different things. To teach you and talk about like why people would attack infrastructure and how easy it is to attack. And you should also talk about to utility guys that run and operate in utilities every day, and then kind of get us all on the panel to revisit all these issues. Because when you bring those different skill sets together, you're gonna see the things that a lot of people are missing.
No, that sounds like a great idea, and we're going to do that. If you don't mind, could you maybe leave us with one perspective from like another perspective from the public safety position? We're always talking about the operators and the regulators and stuff, but why is it so important for the public at this point to get in on this?
I think the public needs to understand where their food comes from, where their electric comes from, and where it comes from. They need to understand how these pacemakers and baby monitors and insulin pumps, these connected cars, they need to start looking at how does it work? Why does it work that way? Should it work that way? And they need to start raising hell with Congress, with the FTC, with the SEC, with the insurance companies. Now Moody's is getting involved, so that's cool for me because now they're going to start going after credit ratings for companies. But the public needs to start asking questions. Do I want this device to do this thing? Because my life depends on it, because it does in some cases. The public should also wonder, who's making sure these companies design these things safely. When you ride a train every day, the public should want to know what is positive train control. And oh, by the way, is that positive train control PLC designed with security features? Public should want to know that. Do I feel safe riding trains? These are things that the public needs to be aware of. Unfortunately, I think we're moving so fast that we're going to have a generation of people that don't know how to cook, don't know how to drive, and they don't really care. And their lives is going to be in the hands of whoever made that stuff. And unfortunately, that seems to be American habits, right? That we've become dumb with these smartphones. And I think we're going to get a lot dumber before we get smarter, just because, you and I, we grew up being able to drive cars, ride bikes, change a tire. Hell, man, some of these new cars don't even come with a spare tire because it's illegal to put one in the car.
Yeah.
So I think the public needs to think through old school, like, how does this thing work? Just be curious. Ask the question. Go poke around. Right. Hell, a lot of the information is public, and that's how the attackers get to it.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Once again, everyone, this is Isiah Jones, and he is one of the best security experts that I've ever met. I'll tell you that. And Isiah, thanks so much for joining us here on Risk Work, and we can't wait to have you back.
No, I appreciate it, Mike. Thank you. And Dave, thank you as well. It's always great to kind of just, spread some awareness. So always humbled when people ask me to do it.
No, and I thank you for bringing up David. David is my son, David Barthel, who's actually the producer of this show. So we both thank you, Isiah, and I can't wait to talk to you soon here, buddy.
Likewise, brother. Appreciate it. Keep fighting.
All right, brother.
Let me tell you about my job.